Miss Marple, and the photograph that revealed the murder. Chapter 1. The garden party. The afternoon sun filtered through the ancient oaks that bordered Thornfield House, casting dappled shadows across the croquet lawn. It was the sort of English summer day that seemed designed specifically for garden parties, the kind where the air smelled of roses and cut grass, where cream teas were served on delicate china, and where nothing more troublesome than a misplaced croquet ball was expected to occur. Miss Jane Marple sat beneath a white parasol, ostensibly watching the game unfold before her, though her pale blue eyes were occupied with something far more interesting than the placement of wooden balls. At 83, she had cultivated the appearance of a harmless elderly woman, white hair pinned in soft waves, cardigan despite the warmth, sensible shoes, and she had learned that this appearance was a far more effective tool than any Scotland Yard detective's credentials. "Do you take milk, Miss Marple?" Mrs. Eleanor Thornfield offered, leaning forward with a teapot. Eleanor was the sort of woman one imagined when thinking of the perfect village hostess, elegant without ostentation, warm without being familiar. Her pale blue dress matched the summer sky, and her blonde hair, only just beginning to silver, was arranged with effortless grace. "How very kind," Miss Marple replied, accepting the cup. "You've outdone yourself again, Eleanor. The roses this year are particularly magnificent." Eleanor smiled, but there was something fractured in it, a smile held together by will rather than genuine pleasure. Miss Marple had known Eleanor Thornfield for 20 years, ever since moving to the village of St. Edmunds, and she had watched that smile grow increasingly rehearsed. "Mother has always had a gift for gardening," a voice said from across the lawn. Christopher Thornfield, Eleanor's son, approached with the casual confidence of a man accustomed to admiration. At 42, he possessed his mother's delicate features and golden coloring, though his eyes held none of her warmth. Instead, they gleamed with the calculating intelligence of someone perpetually assessing advantage. "How is the London office treating you, Christopher?" Miss Marple asked, though she already knew. The village was small enough that one could learn a person's entire life story simply by attending the post office. "Taxing," he admitted, settling into a nearby chair, though not as demanding as the domestic situation. "I'm afraid." His eyes flickered toward his mother, and Eleanor's smile became noticeably tighter. The tension between them was like a discordant note in an otherwise pleasant symphony, and it interested Miss Marple considerably. She had observed such tensions many times before in gardens not unlike this one, in drawing rooms across England, wherever families gathered and resentments quietly festered. "The Hartleys have arrived," Eleanor announced, with perhaps too much brightness, gesturing toward the garden gate where a man and woman were making their entrance. Dr. James Hartley was a handsome man of approximately 60, with silver hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to authority. His wife, Patricia, was at least 20 years his junior, a fact that had caused considerable discussion when they married 5 years ago. She had been his receptionist, and the village had delighted in the scandal of it all with that particular mixture of envy and disapproval that characterized small communities. Patricia waved elegantly, her diamond bracelet catching the sunlight. She was the sort of beautiful that required constant maintenance. Her hair was meticulously styled, her makeup immaculate despite the heat, her designer dress carefully chosen. Yet there was something desperate in her beauty, something that suggested it was armor rather than adornment. "Patricia, you look absolutely stunning," Eleanor said, greeting them with kisses to both cheeks. "I'm so pleased you could come. Wouldn't miss it," Patricia replied, her eyes scanning the gathering. When her gaze landed on Christopher, Something flickered: recognition, history, tension. Miss Marple sipped her tea and noticed everything. Also present were the Blackwoods, Thomas and his sister Margaret, who lived in the cottage just beyond the Thornfield estate. Thomas was the village solicitor, a meticulous man in his 50s, and Margaret kept house for him, a spinster of considerable skill in household management and, it seemed, in the collection and dissemination of village gossip. There was also young Lucy Hammond, the village schoolteacher, whose fresh enthusiasm for life had not yet been worn down by disappointment. She sat near Christopher now, laughing at something he had said, her face flushed with the particular joy of youth and undivided attention from someone she clearly admired. And there was Charles Pembroke, the retired physician who lived alone at Pembroke House and came to Eleanor's parties largely out of habit. He was a quiet man, observant in his own way, with the bearing of someone who had seen too much of human nature in his medical practice to find anything surprising anymore. The conversation drifted pleasantly through the afternoon. Gossip about the new vicar's progressive ideas, speculation about whether the old mill would finally be converted to cottages, complaints about the rising cost of everything. The croquet game continued, interspersed with laughter and good-natured competition. It was nearly 5 o'clock when Eleanor stood to announce that she was going to fetch the special cakes she had prepared. "I've just remembered I left them in the morning room," she said. "Do help yourselves to more tea, everyone. I'll be back directly." She disappeared into the house, her blue dress fading through the French doors. The gathering relaxed slightly in her absence. People always do when the hostess is not watching. Conversations became more candid, more revealing. Thomas Blackwood began a story about a complicated property dispute. Lucy and Christopher's heads bent together in private conversation. Patricia excused herself to admire the roses. What happened next occurred so quickly that the sequence of events would later be hotly debated. Terrible, distinctly Eleanor's pierced through the house and into the garden. Everyone froze. Then, in a flurry of movement, guests rushed toward the French doors. Miss Marple remained seated, her teacup still in hand, observing the chaos with the calm of someone who had witnessed human nature at its most raw too many times to be truly shocked. Charles Pembroke reached the doors first, pushing through with the authority of a man accustomed to medical emergencies. What he found inside caused him to stop so abruptly that the others collided behind him. Eleanor Thornfield lay on the morning room floor, her elegant blue dress dark with blood. Beside her, on the marble tiles, was a silver-framed photograph, the glass shattered, the image hidden in shards. "Call the police," Charles said quietly, "and someone fetch Dr. Matthews, though I suspect he won't be needed." Eleanor Thornfield, it seemed, would not be hosting many more garden parties. Chapter 2. The Photograph. Morning room of Thornfield. House had transformed into something altogether different from the gracious space it had been that morning. Police constables stood at intervals, their presence making the elegant furnishings seem suddenly shabby, the afternoon lights suddenly harsh. The photograph lay on the side table now, carefully placed in an evidence bag. Its shattered frame, an obscured image, a silent witness to Eleanor. Thornfield's final moments. Inspector Graves was a competent man in his 50s, with the weary expression of someone who had seen enough of human cruelty to believe it capable of anything. He stood over Eleanor's body, still not yet removed, still precisely where she had fallen, and made notes in a small leather notebook with methodical precision. The weapon? He asked the constable beside him. A letter opener, sir. Silver, possibly valuable. Belonged to the house, according to Mrs. Thornfield's son. We've bagged it. Inspector Graves nodded. A letter opener. A crime of passion, perhaps, or a crime of opportunity. The sort of weapon suggested by rage rather than premeditation. Outside, in the garden, the remaining guests were being interviewed separately. The tea service remained on the lawn, now cold and abandoned, an eerie monument to the interrupted afternoon. Miss Marple sat in a wicker chair near the French doors, responding to Constable Webb's questions with the composed politeness of a woman accustomed to cooperating with authority. You didn't see Mrs. Thornfield leave the garden? Webb asked, pen poised over his notebook. No, dear, Miss Marple replied. I was focused on the croquet game, you see. One does concentrate rather on the placement of the ball. Though I did notice that Eleanor seemed somewhat preoccupied when she served my tea. Not her usual self, if I'm being frank. Preoccupied how? Miss Marple considered this with genuine thoughtfulness, as though she had something on her mind. The sort of worry that doesn't announce itself loudly, but rather sits beneath the surface. Rather like the roots of the garden she was so proud of. Webb made a note and moved on to Patricia Hartley, who was dabbing her eyes with an expensive handkerchief and insisting that she had barely known Eleanor at all. A lovely woman, Patricia said, though her voice suggested she was reciting a line from a play. Though we weren't particularly close, of course. James and I have only been in the village 5 years. What? Patricia didn't mention, but what Margaret Blackwood had already whispered to anyone within hearing distance was that Patricia had been seen taking walks with Christopher Thornfield on several occasions. Innocent walks, perhaps. But the village had its opinions on innocence. Christopher himself sat near the garden wall, his handsome face composed into an expression of grief that didn't quite reach his eyes. When Inspector Graves approached him, Christopher stood immediately, offering his full cooperation. My mother and I had our differences, Christopher admitted freely, as though honesty were a shield against suspicion. We always did. Mother was rather old-fashioned in her views, and I have more progressive ideas about how one should live. But I loved her, Inspector. Whatever our disagreements, I am her son. Where were you when she screamed? Graves asked. In the garden, as I said. I was speaking with Miss Hammond about the new school curriculum. Lucy Hammond, questioned a few moments later, confirmed this with a flush to her cheeks that suggested the conversation may have been more intimate than merely academic. Dr. Hartley proved less forthcoming. He insisted that the whole affair was shocking and unfortunate, but his primary concern seemed to be ensuring that his wife wasn't interrogated too thoroughly. My wife is a sensitive woman, Inspector. The stress of questioning could be quite damaging to her health. The deceased is rather more damaged than that, Graves replied dryly. Thomas Blackwood. The solicitor answered questions with the careful precision of a man accustomed to legal implications. No, he had seen nothing. No, he couldn't say he knew Eleanor well, though she had been a client years ago regarding some property matter. He was careful to mention that he had been with his sister during the relevant time of detail that Margaret confirmed with perhaps unnecessary enthusiasm. But it was Miss Marple who, hours later, when the initial chaos had settled somewhat, made a small observation to Inspector Graves as he was preparing to depart. The photograph, Inspector, she said softly. The one that was beside Mrs. Thornfield. Graves paused. What about it? Well, you see, Eleanor always displayed her photographs in the parlor. Family portraits, holiday snapshots from Venice. A lovely one of her parents taken in 1923. But that particular photograph in the morning room, I don't recall ever seeing it before. And the frame, though it certainly looked expensive, seemed rather new. Don't you find it curious that someone should keep a photograph hidden away in the morning room? Graves studied her thoughtfully. You're suggesting the photograph is significant. I'm not suggesting anything, Inspector. I'm merely observing. In my experience, the things people choose to hide, and the lengths they go to hide them often reveal rather more about the crime than the crime itself reveals. That night, as Miss Marple sat in her comfortable cottage on the edge of the village, she found herself thinking about Eleanor Thornfield. Eleanor, who had served tea with a strained smile. Eleanor, who had excused herself to fetch cakes, but had instead met her death. Eleanor, whose final moments had been violent enough to scatter a hidden photograph across marble floors. And Miss Marple thought about the shattered photograph, whose image remained obscured by glass and circumstance. And she wondered what image had been so precious, so dangerous, that someone had been willing to kill to keep it hidden. In the morning, when the village awoke, Eleanor Thornfield would already be becoming legend. By evening, the legend would be told a dozen different ways. But the truth, Miss Marple suspected, lay in that photograph. She knitted steadily into the evening, her needles clicking with rhythmic precision, and waited for the pieces to reveal themselves. Chapter 3. Village Whispers. By the following morning, St. Edmund's had transformed into a living organism of speculation and gossip. The murder had breathed a strange vitality into the village, replacing the gentle rhythms of summer routine with the feverish excitement of scandal. Conversations that would normally have taken place in hushed tones at the post office or the village shop now erupted across garden fences and in the tea rooms with barely concealed enthusiasm. Miss Marple heard that theories proliferate as she made her morning rounds. At the greengrocer's, she learned that Eleanor had been having an affair with the vicar, a notion so absurd that even its proponents seemed uncertain of it. At the post office, the consensus had shifted to Christopher being the culprit, motivated by his desire to inherit his mother's considerable estate before she could change her will. By the time Miss Marple reached the village hall, where Margaret Blackwood was organizing the flower arrangements for the upcoming harvest festival with grim determination, the theory had evolved into something far more salacious: the photographs. You see, Margaret was saying to Mrs. Hawthorne, the vicar's wife, with the particular satisfaction of someone imparting forbidden knowledge, they weren't ordinary family pictures. I have it on good authority from someone who knows the maid quite well that there were compromising images, the sort of thing that would absolutely ruin a family's reputation. What sort of compromising? Mrs. Hawthorne asked, her eyes wide with the hunger for details. Margaret lowered her voice conspiratorially. I couldn't possibly say. Not appropriate for polite conversation. But let us simply note that Christopher has been rather friendly with the and that Patricia Hartley was seen leaving the Thornfield estate at an unusual hour last Tuesday. Miss Marple, arranging white chrysanthemums with practiced care, listened without appearing to listen. This was the village's version of detective work, taking facts and transforming them through the alchemy of assumption into something both more sensational and less true, yet occasionally buried within the fabrications. One found genuine observation. That afternoon, she encountered Dr. Hartley outside his medical practice. He was locking the door, his expression tense, his usually immaculate appearance slightly disheveled. Dr. Hartley, Miss Marple greeted him. "I hope your wife is bearing up well." Such a shock for everyone, but particularly for those who were present. "Patricia is resilient," he replied, perhaps too curtly, "though she's been rather distressed. She's resting this afternoon, of course." "And how is your relationship with Mrs. Thornfield? I understand she was a patient of yours." Something flickered across Hartley's face, irritation, perhaps, or concern. "Professional relationship only, Miss Marple. Though I will say that Eleanor had been under considerable stress lately. I'd prescribed her something to help with sleep. She hadn't been managing well." "Stress about what, do you suppose?" Miss Marple asked gently. "I'm hardly in a position to discuss patient confidentiality," Hartley said, already turning away. "Though I will say that family matters seemed to be occupying her thoughts considerably." He departed with the brusqueness of a man unwilling to continue the conversation, leaving Miss Marple standing on the pavement with her shopping basket and her thoughts. Later that day, she encountered Lucy Hammond near the school. The young teacher was walking with considerably less buoyancy than usual, her face troubled, her eyes red-rimmed from tears. "Miss Hammond," Miss Marple called out. "Are you quite well? You seem distressed." Lucy glanced around nervously before stepping closer. "I hardly know what to think, Miss Marple. The police questioned me yesterday about Christopher, and now people are saying the most dreadful things. They're implying that Christopher and that we were involved in some improper manner, and were you?" Miss Marple asked with the directness that sometimes startled people into honesty. "No. That is, we were friendly, but nothing untoward. Christopher was always pleasant to me at the garden party. But Miss Marple, I'm terrified now because I realize I may have misjudged his character entirely. What if he truly did hurt Mrs. Thornfield? What if my presence in the garden was the only thing preventing him from—" She stopped, unable to articulate the rest. "Tell me, Lucy, did you observe Christopher's demeanor throughout the afternoon, before Mrs. Thornfield's death?" Lucy considered this carefully. "He seemed distracted, not his usual charming self. When Mrs. Thornfield was serving tea, I noticed he watched her rather intently, as though he were waiting for something. And when she excused herself to fetch the cakes, he looked almost relieved." "Interesting," Miss Marple mused. "And Patricia Hartley, did you observe her behavior?" "Mrs. Hartley?" Lucy's eyes widened. "I suppose she seemed nervous. She kept checking her appearance in the garden mirror, and she excused herself several times. Once I saw her standing near the French doors, looking into the house as though trying to see through the walls." By evening, Miss Marple had woven together enough observations to construct a preliminary picture, though it remained incomplete. The photograph was central, she was certain of that. A hidden photograph, precious enough to conceal, dangerous enough to kill for. But whose image did it contain? And who had known about it? She sat in her garden as twilight descended, watching the light fade from gold to purple to deep blue. Somewhere in the village, a murderer moved about their ordinary business, attending to ordinary tasks, trying desperately to appear ordinary. And somewhere in that deliberate ordinariness lay the truth. Inspector Graves had sent word that the photograph's image had been photographically restored. A specialist from the city had examined it and would have results within days. Miss Marple suspected that when that image was finally revealed, it would illuminate not Eleanor's death, but rather the complex web of secrets that had made that death inevitable. She picked up her knitting and settled into her chair, her needles resuming their familiar rhythm. The pieces were still scattered, the patterns still obscured, but patterns she had learned across 83 years of careful observation always eventually emerged. One simply had to be patient enough to see them. Chapter 4. The obvious suspect. Inspector Graves had made his decision by Thursday morning. The evidence, though circumstantial, was compelling enough to warrant an arrest, and he had little patience for the sort of prolonged investigation that often led nowhere. Christopher Thornfield was summoned to the police station, and by noon, the village knew that Eleanor's son had been taken into custody. The news travelled through St. Edmunds with the speed of wildfire. By lunchtime, it had been embellished, analysed, and accepted as fact by nearly everyone. Christopher had always been difficult, people said. He'd always resented his mother's control. The inheritance made perfect sense as a motive, and Lucy Hammond's testimony about his distracted state during the garden party seemed, in retrospect, clearly indicative of premeditation. He was planning it even then, Margaret Blackwood declared at the post office, speaking with the confidence of someone who had not actually witnessed the garden party firsthand, watching his mother, calculating the precise moment when she would be alone. Absolutely chilling when you think about it. Miss Marple purchased her stamps and said nothing, though her silence seemed to register with the postmistress as a form of disagreement. That afternoon, she visited Inspector Graves at his temporary office in the village hall. The inspector was reviewing documents when she arrived, and he looked up with the weary expression of a man who had found a solution that satisfied bureaucracy, if not his conscience. "Miss Marple," he greeted her. "I assume you've heard we've made an arrest." "I have," she replied, settling into the chair he offered, "though I confess I find myself rather puzzled by the conclusion. Graves set down his pen with deliberate care. Miss Marple, I respect your observations. You made a valuable point about the photograph. But Christopher Thornfield had motive, opportunity, and means. He was present in the garden. His relationship with his mother was documented as contentious. And we've discovered that Eleanor's will, written 3 years ago, leaves the bulk of her estate to her son. Has Mr. Thornfield expressed anger about that will? Miss Marple asked. Not directly, but and the letter opener. Has it been established that Mr. Thornfield had particular familiarity with it? That he would naturally think to use it as a weapon? It was in the morning room, Graves said, his patience beginning to fray. Accessible to anyone in the house. Precisely, Miss Marple said gently. Accessible to anyone. Yet the killer chose it without hesitation. Used it with surprising efficiency for someone committing what would be, presumably, their first murder. A person committing crime in the heat of passion typically reaches for whatever is nearest without calculation. But a letter opener, positioned on a desk that requires deliberation. Graves leaned back in his chair. You're suggesting the murder was premeditated. I'm suggesting nothing definitively. I'm merely noting inconsistencies between the theory of a son overcome with rage and the facts we've observed. And what of the photograph? Graves asked. The lab results came back this morning. The image has been restored. Would you like to see it? He produced a glossy photograph, recently developed. Miss Marple studied it carefully, and something flickered across her face recognition. Perhaps, or confirmation of a suspicion long held. Interesting, she murmured, handing it back. Most illuminating, though not in the way one might have expected. Will you tell me what you see? Graves asked, frustration creeping into his voice. I see that Eleanor Thornfield was keeping a secret that someone else was willing to kill to protect. And I see that Christopher Thornfield, whatever his faults, was not the person most threatened by that secret's revelation. Over the following days, the village settled into the rhythms of anticipation and delayed justice. Christopher remained in custody, his solicitor notably not Thomas Blackwood, who had disqualified himself due to prior professional connections, working toward his preliminary hearing. The media, having discovered a delicious scandal in a quiet English village, began descending on St. Edmunds. Reporters interviewed villagers, who provided increasingly exaggerated accounts of Christopher's difficult nature and Eleanor's desperation. Yet something troubled Miss Marple as she observed the proceedings. The too easy acceptance of Christopher's guilt. The way Inspector Graves seemed relieved to have a solution, even one that didn't quite fit. The manner in which the village had collectively decided on a narrative and sealed it. Away from examination, she visited Christopher in custody on Friday afternoon. A visit that Inspector Graves permitted with visible reluctance. Christopher looked diminished in the police station, stripped of the confidence that usually surrounded him. But when he saw Miss Marple, something like desperate hope flickered across his face. Miss Marple, he said immediately, thank God you don't believe I did this, do you? You, of all people, with your reputation for understanding human nature. What I believe is less important than what is true, Miss Marple replied, sitting across from him. Tell me, Christopher, why were you watching your mother during the garden party? He flushed, embarrassed. I wasn't, Lucy Hammond noticed. Others likely noticed as well. You were observing her with considerable intensity. Christopher was silent for a moment. Then, because I was worried about her. She'd been acting strangely for weeks. Anxious, distracted. I was trying to determine if there was something I could do to help. Mother and I didn't always agree, Miss Marple, but I did care about her welfare. And the photograph. What do you know of it? His expression shifted to confusion. What photograph? The police kept asking me about it, but I genuinely don't know what they're referring to. Miss Marple studied his face with the intensity of someone reading a manuscript, written in the language of truth and deception. And what she read convinced her, beyond doubt, that Christopher Thornfield was telling her the truth, which meant the guilty party was still walking free, and a terrible injustice was being allowed to proceed unopposed. Chapter 5. The Hidden Detail. Ms. Marple left the police station with a burden of knowledge that felt heavier than her years. Christopher Thornfield's innocence was as clear to her as the afternoon sun. Yet the machinery of justice was grinding forward with mechanical indifference, toward a conviction built on circumstance rather than truth. She found herself in an unusual position, not quite certain what to do with her conviction. Uncertain whether anyone would listen to an elderly woman's intuitions against the solid architecture of evidence. That evening, she did something she rarely did. She visited Thomas Blackwood at his home, a Victorian cottage just beyond the village green. Thomas answered the door with visible surprise, his precisely combed hair and formal waistcoat suggesting he had been occupied with legal documents. As was his custom most evenings. "Miss Marple," he said warmly, ushering her inside. "This is an unexpected pleasure. Margaret is at a church committee meeting, but do come in. I was just reviewing some property matters." They settled in his study, a room lined with law books and filing cabinets. everything arranged with the obsessive neatness of someone for whom order was a necessity rather than a preference. Thomas poured her a glass of sherry from an expensive decanter, the gesture courteous but slightly mechanical. "I've come to ask you something," Miss Marple began, accepting the glass. "Regarding Eleanor Thornfield's legal affairs. You mentioned years ago handling some property matter for her. Did your professional relationship continue beyond that?" Thomas hesitated fractionally. Eleanor was a client of the firm on several occasions. Nothing particularly significant. "Why do you ask?" "Because I'm wondering whether Eleanor might have consulted you about matters beyond property. Personal matters, perhaps. The sort of things that would require absolute confidentiality." "Client confidentiality is sacred, Miss Marple," Thomas replied, his voice taking on the formal tone of someone reciting professional principles. "I couldn't possibly discuss any client's private affairs, regardless of he stopped himself, regardless of circumstances. But he had already revealed something through his careful non-revelation. Eleanor had consulted him about something sensitive, something that required legal expertise and discretion." "Of course," Miss Marple said smoothly. "I wouldn't dream of asking you to breach professional confidentiality. I was merely wondering if you might offer me a hypothetical perspective on a matter of estate law." Thomas relaxed slightly, relieved by the shift to theoretical ground. "I could certainly attempt that. What is your hypothetical scenario?" "Suppose," Miss Marple said carefully, "that a person had come into possession of documents or photographs that revealed information about another person, information that could damage that person's reputation or career. And suppose the person holding these documents was considering how to handle them ethically and legally. What would you advise?" Thomas became very still. That would depend entirely on the nature of the information and the relationship between the parties involved, and on whether the information had been obtained legally or otherwise, and if the person holding the documents suddenly died before they could act on their intention to reveal the information, what would happen to those documents? "They would be part of the estate," Thomas said slowly, "subject to the terms of the will and the legal jurisdiction governing inheritance." "But Miss Marple, I'm not entirely comfortable with this line of questioning. It feels less like a hypothetical and more like an interrogation regarding real events." Miss Marple smiled apologetically. "You're quite right, and I do apologize. I was being rather transparent, wasn't I? The truth is, I'm concerned that an innocent person may be convicted of a crime he didn't commit, and I'm trying to understand the circumstances surrounding Eleanor's death more completely." Thomas stood and walked to his filing cabinet, his movements deliberate. He opened a drawer and withdrew a folder, which he held but did not open. "If I were to speak hypothetically," he said carefully, "about a client who had consulted me regarding estate matters and the safekeeping of sensitive documents, I might say that some clients fear what their families might do with certain information. Some clients wish to protect others, even at great personal cost. And some clients struggle with the moral weight of secrets that aren't theirs alone to keep." "Did Eleanor fear something?" Miss Marple asked softly. "I cannot confirm or deny the existence of any specific client relationship or its contents. But I can say that Eleanor Thornfield was a woman of conscience who carried burdens that weighed upon her increasingly as the summer progressed." He returned the folder to the cabinet without opening it, a deliberate gesture that conveyed both information and its limitations. Miss Marple left Thomas's home with more questions than answers, but with a clearer sense of the contours of Eleanor's secret. There was a photograph now, revealed in the police laboratory, though its contents remained a puzzle to most. There were documents, possibly stored in Thomas's custody or Eleanor's safe deposit box. And there was a secret significant enough to kill for, which meant it implicated someone in the village in a matter serious enough to warrant murder. The following morning, Miss Marple made an unannounced visit to Dr. Hartley's residence. Patricia answered the door, and even from across the threshold, Miss Marple could sense the tension radiating from her. "Miss Marple," Patricia said, her voice carefully controlled. "What a surprise. Do come in." The house was expensively decorated, but somehow sterile, lacking the warmth that a true home possessed. Patricia poured tea with trembling hands, and Miss Marple observed everything, the nervous glances toward the window, the way Patricia's fingers twisted together, the small signs of a woman under extraordinary stress. "I've been thinking about the garden party," Miss Marple said conversationally, "about your walk to admire the roses. You were gone for several minutes, weren't you?" Patricia's cup paused halfway to her lips. "I simply wanted to see Eleanor's rose garden. It's quite famous in the village, of course." "And did you see Eleanor while you were outside?" "No," Patricia said quickly. "I saw no one." But she had seen someone, Miss Marple was certain. Or perhaps she had done something, some small action that now gnawed at her conscience. The photograph flashed in her mind the restored image that Inspector Graves had shown her. The image of a much younger Patricia, perhaps 20 years younger, in a situation that explained everything about her anxiety, her marriage to a much older man, her careful construction of respectability in a small village. That afternoon, Miss Marple returned to her cottage and sat in her garden with her knitting. The pattern was becoming clearer, the stitches forming recognizable shapes. But there remained one final piece: the person for whom the photograph represented not just embarrassment, but catastrophe. The person for whom Eleanor's conscience had become a death sentence. And Miss Marple suspected she knew exactly who that person was. Chapter 6. The Fracturing by Saturday Morning. The village had begun to sense that something was wrong with the official narrative. The arrest of Christopher Thornfield, which had initially satisfied the collective need for resolution, had started to feel increasingly like a performance rather than justice. Doubt, once planted, grows with remarkable speed, and doubt had taken root in St. Edmunds like an invasive weed. Miss Marple became aware of this shifting sentiment when she encountered young Lucy Hammond at the market. The schoolteacher's eyes were redrimmed, and her expression carried the particular anguish of someone who had realized they might have contributed to an injustice. "Miss Marple," Lucy said urgently, pulling her aside. "I've been thinking about my statement to the police, about Christopher watching his mother. I think I may have misinterpreted what I saw. He wasn't watching her with anything malicious in his expression. He looked concerned, if anything. Protective, even. Why do you think you misinterpreted it initially?" Miss Marple asked gently. "Because I was flattered by his attention," Lucy admitted, her face flushing with shame. "When the police suggested he might have been observing his mother for sinister purposes, I suppose I wanted to seem more perceptive than I actually was. I wanted to provide them with helpful information, and I convinced myself that I had witnessed something darker than what was actually there." "You're not the first person to do so," Miss Marple said kindly. "Human memory is remarkably flexible, particularly when we believe we're being helpful." That same afternoon, Margaret Blackwood arrived at Miss Marple's cottage with an expression of distinct discomfort. Margaret, who trafficked in gossip as other women trafficked in flour and sugar, was struggling with the weight of her own words. "I may have been rather hasty in my observations," Margaret began, settling into Miss Marple's parlour with visible reluctance. "Regarding Patricia Hartley and Christopher, I saw them speaking together at the garden party, but I don't actually know what was discussed. I've been elaborating on the encounter in ways that weren't entirely accurate." "Why did you do that?" Miss Marple asked, offering her a cup of tea. "Because scandal is more interesting than innocence," Margaret said with surprising honesty. "And because once you begin constructing a narrative, it becomes easier to add details that support it than to acknowledge that perhaps you've been mistaken. But now I'm terrified that my careless tongue has contributed to an innocent man's conviction." The confession hung between them, heavy with implications. On Sunday, Miss Marple attended church and observed Dr. Hartley with renewed attention. He sat rigidly in his pew, his jaw clenched, his eyes focused on the vicar's sermon without actually appearing to listen. Beside him, Patricia clutched her hymnal as though it were a life preserver, her knuckles white with tension. Their shoulders didn't touch. They didn't exchange a single glance throughout the entire service. After the service, Miss Marple contrived to speak with Dr. Hartley privately, intercepting him near the church gate as Patricia lingered inside. Speaking with the vicar's wife, Dr. Hartley, Miss Marple said quietly, "I wonder if I might ask you something in confidence." "Your professional confidence, as it were." Hartley's expression became guarded. "That depends on what you're asking, Miss Marple. I'm asking whether you've been concerned about your wife's emotional state recently, particularly following Eleanor Thornfield's death." Hartley's jaw tightened further. "My wife is naturally distressed by the murder of a neighbour, as are we all. Yes, but there's distress that comes from tragedy, and there's distress that comes from guilt or fear. Patricia seems to be experiencing the latter." "I don't appreciate the insinuation," Hartley said coldly, moving away. But Miss Marple caught his arm gently. "I'm not insinuating anything about your wife, Dr. Hartley. I'm suggesting that you might be protecting someone you care about, and that protecting them through allowing an innocent man to be convicted might ultimately harm them far more than the truth would. Hartley stared at her for a long moment, his face a battlefield of conflicting emotions. Then he extracted his arm and walked away, his pace deliberately measured, his composure carefully maintained. That evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. Inspector Graves appeared at her cottage with the bearing of a man who had come to ask for something he wasn't certain he had the right to request. "I've been reviewing the case," he said without preamble, settling into her sitting room with visible discomfort, "and I find myself troubled by several details. You implied previously that Christopher Thornfield wasn't the guilty party. I wonder if you might be more direct about what you believe actually occurred." "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that Eleanor Thornfield discovered something through the photograph or through other means that implicated someone in the village in a serious matter. Someone whose reputation, or perhaps whose career or freedom, would be destroyed by the revelation of that information." "Who?" Graves asked bluntly. "I'm not yet certain enough to name names without absolute proof. But I believe Eleanor intended to handle the matter carefully, perhaps seeking legal counsel to determine how to proceed ethically. However, someone discovered her intention before she could act. Someone panicked, and this someone killed her to prevent the revelation." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "though perhaps not premeditated murder. Perhaps they came to the morning room to reason with her, to convince her to remain silent. And when reason failed, when Eleanor remained resolute about doing what she believed was right, the situation escalated. A letter opener was at hand. Rage and desperation overcame judgment." Graves stood and paced the room. "That's still largely speculation, Miss Marple. I need evidence. Something concrete." "Then I suggest you examine the photograph more carefully," Miss Marple said, "particularly the background elements. And I suggest you investigate who among our villagers has the most to lose from its revelation." After Graves departed, Miss Marple sat in her garden as darkness descended. Tomorrow would be a day of reckoning, she suspected. The pieces were nearly all in place, the pattern nearly complete. But one thread remained to be pulled, one final test to be administered, and that test would require her to play a dangerous game with someone who had already proven willing to kill. The thought didn't frighten her. At 83, having witnessed human nature across nearly a century of observation, Miss Marple understood that truth, however delayed, eventually demanded to be acknowledged, and she intended to be the instrument through which that demand was made. Chapter 7. The confession. Monday morning brought rain to St. Edmund's, the sort of grey, persistent drizzle that seemed to match the villagers' collective mood of uncertainty and unease. Miss Marple received a telephone call at 9 o'clock, her number apparently obtained through the village directory. The voice on the other end was Patricia Hartley's, strained and barely controlled. "Miss Marple, I need to speak with you. Urgently. Not at home. Not anywhere James might find out. There's a small cafe in the next village, the Crown Tea Room. Could you meet me there at 10:30? Miss Marple agreed, though she suspected she knew what Patricia intended to confess. The human capacity for carrying guilt, she had learned, was remarkably limited. Eventually, the weight became unbearable, and people sought relief through confession, even when confession might destroy them. The Crown Tea Room was nearly empty when Miss Marple arrived. A small establishment catering to passing travellers rather than locals. Patricia sat at a corner table, her hands wrapped around a cup of untouched tea, her eyes hollow with sleeplessness. "Thank you for coming," Patricia said immediately, her voice barely above a whisper. I couldn't let them convict Christopher. Not when her voice broke, and she paused to compose herself. Not when I know what actually happened. "Tell me," Miss Marple said simply, settling into the chair across from her. Patricia's hands trembled as she spoke. "The photograph. It was taken 22 years ago, before I came to the village. I was younger then, desperate, alone. I was involved with a man, someone very prominent in London. Someone married, someone with considerable influence. The photograph documented an indiscretion, a physical relationship that should never have happened." She paused, gathering courage for the next part. "Eleanor found the photograph. Not through any fault of mine. James had kept it all these years, hidden in an old box in his study. Eleanor discovered it when she was consulting with James about some legal matter regarding a property dispute. She saw it, recognized me immediately, and confronted me about it." "When did this confrontation occur?" Miss Marple asked. 3 weeks ago. I was devastated. I begged Eleanor not to tell anyone, not to reveal that James knew about my past indiscretion. I explained that our marriage was precarious enough without that knowledge becoming public. But Eleanor said she couldn't in good conscience keep silent. She said the man in the photograph, the man who had seduced me while I was vulnerable and alone, was now involved in politics. She believed the public had a right to know about his character before voting for him. Miss Marple listened without interrupting, understanding the contours of the tragedy that had unfolded. I begged her, Patricia continued, tears now streaming down her face. I got down on my knees and begged her not to destroy my life. But Eleanor was adamant. She said she had already consulted with Thomas Blackwood about how to proceed legally. She said she would give me a week to tell James myself, but after that she would be compelled by her conscience to act. "And the garden party?" Miss Marple prompted gently. Eleanor told me that morning that she had decided to wait no longer. She was going to speak with Thomas that very day about officially filing a complaint with the Electoral Commission. I panicked. I wasn't thinking clearly. When I saw her heading to the morning room, I followed her. I needed to make her understand what she was about to do, not just to me, but to James, to our family. Patricia's voice became almost inaudible. We argued. Eleanor was unmoved by my pleas. She said morality wasn't negotiable, that she couldn't live with herself if she remained silent while a man of dubious character ascended to power. I told her she was being capricious, that she had no right to make decisions that would destroy innocent people's lives. She said everyone makes choices, and sometimes those choices have consequences. What happened next? Miss Marple asked. I was so angry, so desperate. The letter opener was on the desk. I don't even remember consciously reaching for it. I couldn't let her leave that room. I couldn't let her contact Thomas. I struck her once, twice. It was almost involuntary, like something else was controlling my body. And then she was on the floor, and there was blood. And I realized what I'd done. Patricia buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with sobs that seemed to come from the deepest part of her being. Why are you telling me this? Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew. Because Christopher didn't deserve this. Because I've spent the last week watching an innocent man's life be destroyed while I remained silent. Because I can't sleep, can't eat, can't bear the weight of what I've done. And because I thought perhaps you would know what I should do. Miss Marple reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over Patricia's clenched fists. You know what you should do, Patricia. You've known since the moment you committed this act. The only question has been whether you possess the courage to do it. If I confess, James will divorce me. I'll lose everything, my home, my position, my respectability. Yes, Miss Marple acknowledged. You will lose those things, but you'll gain something far more valuable, the ability to live with yourself, and you'll save an innocent man from a conviction that would haunt his life forever. Patricia was quiet for a long moment, her face a study in the struggle between self-preservation and conscience. Finally, she straightened her shoulders, wiped her eyes, and nodded slowly. I'll go to the police, she said quietly. This afternoon. I'll tell Inspector Graves everything. I'll accompany you, Miss Marple said. If you wish. Yes, Patricia whispered. I think I need someone to witness it, to confirm that I didn't imagine some version of events that's more palatable than the truth. As they prepared to leave the tea room, Patricia paused and looked at Miss Marple with something like gratitude mixed with despair. How did you know? She asked. How did you know it was me? Miss Marple smiled sadly. Because I've been observing human nature for 83 years, Patricia, and I've learned that the person most likely to commit a crime is not always the person most obviously suspicious. It's often the person whose desperation has finally overcome their capacity for restraint. You wore that desperation plainly, once one knew where to look. They departed the cafe together, stepping out into the grey rain that continued to fall, indifferent to human tragedy, as rain always does. Chapter 8. The unraveling Inspector Graves sat across from Patricia Hartley in the interrogation room, his expression a mixture of frustration and vindication. The confession had come swiftly, almost eagerly, as though Patricia had been waiting for permission to release the burden she had carried. A solicitor sat beside her, Thomas Blackwood, who had accepted the case with visible reluctance and professional duty, and Miss Marple observed the proceedings from the observation room with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had witnessed the architecture of truth finally assembled. Patricia's confession was methodical and detailed. She described her panic when Eleanor announced her intention to reveal the photograph. She explained the argument in the morning room, how her desperation had escalated into violence. She acknowledged the letter opener, the strike that she had not consciously intended but had committed nonetheless. She detailed the moments afterwards standing over Eleanor's body, the shock of what she had done, the realization that she had destroyed not just one life, but potentially her own as well. "I didn't plan it," Patricia said repeatedly, her voice hollow. "I didn't intend to kill her. I simply couldn't bear the thought of Eleanor revealing my past, of James discovering the truth about who I had been before we married. It was panic and desperation, not premeditation. And yet you allowed Christopher Thornfield to be arrested for a crime you committed," Graves said, his tone carrying the particular coldness of a man whose professional authority had been challenged by circumstance. "I know," Patricia whispered. "I've known every moment since his arrest that he was innocent. But I was terrified. I thought perhaps the evidence against him was stronger than I understood. That perhaps the truth would come out through the investigation. I thought I might be spared. But you came forward today," Graves noted. "What changed your mind?" Patricia's eyes found Miss Marple in the observation window, though of course Patricia couldn't actually see her through the one-way glass. "I realized that hope was a coward's virtue, that staying silent didn't spare me anything except my own conscience. Christopher Thornfield was released within hours, his arrest officially declared a tragic misunderstanding. The press that had descended on St. Edmunds with such enthusiasm for the scandal now pursued Patricia with equal fervor. Their cameras and questions, creating a circus of human suffering that the small village had never before witnessed. Dr. James Hartley, his reputation now irretrievably damaged, filed for divorce immediately. The legal papers served with the efficiency of a man who had already made peace with the dissolution of his marriage. By Tuesday afternoon, the village had settled into the peculiar rhythms of aftermath. The immediate shock had faded, replaced by the more complex process of understanding what had occurred and what it meant about the people they had thought they knew. Miss Marple received visitors throughout the day. Lucy Hammond came first, her guilt about her own misstatement evident in every line of her posture. Christopher Thornfield came later, arriving at her cottage with a bottle of wine and an expression of profound gratitude mixed with disillusionment about his mother's final days. "I wish I'd known," he said, sitting in her garden despite the afternoon chill. "About the photograph, about Eleanor's concern regarding this politician. Perhaps if I'd understood what was troubling her, I could have helped her navigate it differently. Perhaps I could have prevented everything." "You couldn't have prevented it," Miss Marple said gently. "Eleanor made her choice based on her conscience, and Patricia made hers based on desperation. Those are two separate acts of will, and neither belongs to you." "But Mother was trying to do what was right," Christopher protested, "and it cost her life." "Yes," Miss Marple acknowledged. Eleanor believed she was serving justice, but she underestimated the desperation of someone she thought she knew. That's not a moral failing, it's a human one. We all tend to assume that reason and ethics will prevail when we present them with sufficient clarity. We forget that people facing destruction often act with an irrationality that overwhelms logic. Inspector Graves visited that evening, his expression considerably more humble than it had been during the investigation. He sat in Miss Marple's parlour with a cup of tea and acknowledged the gap between his initial conclusion and the actual truth. I was too eager to close the case, he admitted. Christopher fit the obvious pattern: the resentful son, the inheritance, the family discord. I didn't look deeply enough at other possibilities. You were doing what most people do, Miss Marple said, looking for the simplest explanation rather than the most accurate one. It's a very human tendency, and it leads to injustice more often than not. How did you know? Graves asked, repeating the question Patricia had posed. How did you arrive at the truth? By observing what people weren't saying, Miss Marple replied. Patricia was terrified in a way that went beyond normal distress at a neighbor's death. She was afraid of something being discovered, something beyond the simple fact of murder. When you combined her anxiety with the photographs, significance, a photograph hidden away in Eleanor's mourning room rather than displayed with the family, portraits, and the fact that Eleanor had been consulting with Thomas Blackwood about serious legal matters, a different narrative began to emerge. One that didn't require the obvious suspect, Graves said thoughtfully. Precisely. Christopher was too convenient, which made him immediately suspicious to anyone looking beyond the surface. After Graves departed, Miss Marple sat alone in her garden as evening descended. The rain had stopped, leaving the world washed clean and oddly luminous in the fading light. She thought about Eleanor Thornfield, whose final act of conscience had cost her life. She thought about Patricia Hartley, whose desperation had transformed a moment of rage into an irreversible tragedy. She thought about Christopher, who would now carry the knowledge that his mother's death had been caused not by a family member's greed, but by his own social circles, secrets. And she thought about the photograph, that small image that had documented a moment of indiscretion decades in the past, a moment that had reverberated across time to destroy multiple lives in its present. The human capacity for causing harm through the simple act of keeping secrets, or of revealing them, never ceased to astonish her. Every village had its photographs, its hidden histories, its dangerous truths waiting to explode into violence when the pressure became unbearable. Miss Marple picked up her knitting and settled into her chair. The pattern was complete now, fully formed and understood, but the world, she knew, would soon present new patterns to unravel, new mysteries to observe, new secrets to untangle. That was the nature of human existence, an endless series of small dramas, each believing itself unique, each following the patterns that had repeated since humans first learned to conceal their truths from one another. Chapter 9. Miss Marple's final observation. The trial of Patricia Hartley took place on a grey November morning, 6 weeks after Eleanor Thornfield's death. The village of St. Edmunds had largely returned to its ordinary rhythms by then, though the murder had left an indelible mark on the collective consciousness. The school children whispered about it on their way to lessons. The shopkeepers spoke of it in hushed tones when they thought no one was listening, and the church attendance had increased notably, as though proximity to tragedy had suddenly reminded people of their mortality and the need for spiritual accounting. Miss Marple sat in the gallery of the courtroom, her white hair gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights that seemed to drain color from everything they touched. She wore her best navy dress, the one reserved for occasions of genuine importance, and her handbag contained a small packet of barley sugar sweets and her knitting, neither of which she anticipated, needing but which provided her comfort through their presence. The prosecution's case was methodical and thorough. The solicitor presented Patricia's confession, the medical evidence regarding Eleanor's wounds, the testimony of the police regarding the letter opener and the scene in the morning room. Everything pointed toward an unpremeditated crime of passion, a moment when desperation had overcome reason, resulting in death. Patricia's defense team, led by a London solicitor brought in specifically for the trial, attempted to argue for mitigating circumstances. They presented psychiatric testimony regarding the psychological fragility of a woman living under the shadow of a hidden past. They emphasized the years of anxiety Patricia had endured, the constant fear of exposure, the desperation that had finally shattered under the weight of Eleanor's threatened revelation. But the jury, composed of ordinary men and women from the surrounding villages, seemed unmoved by psychological explanations. They had heard the facts, and the facts were damning. A woman had killed another woman to protect a secret. The motivation was understandable, perhaps, but not excusable. During a break in the proceedings, Miss Marple found herself in the corridor outside the courtroom, where Christopher Thornfield stood with Lucy Hammond, their hands intertwined in a gesture of mutual support. The experience of false accusation had, it seemed, created an unexpected bond between them. "Miss Marple," Christopher said, approaching her, "thank you for coming. It means a great deal." "I came to bear witness," Miss Marple replied simply. "Justice, when it finally arrives, deserves to be seen by those who understand its complexity." "Do you think she'll be convicted?" Lucy asked quietly. "Yes," Miss Marple said. "The evidence is substantial, and her own confession removes any reasonable doubt. The question now is not whether she be convicted, but how the conviction will be understood. Will she be seen as a desperate woman driven to violence by circumstances beyond her control? Or will she be seen as a murderer who chose to allow an innocent man to be arrested in her place?" "She did confess," Christopher said defensively. "She could have remained silent, only after weeks of allowing you to suffer the consequences of her actions," Miss Marple replied gently. Conscience eventually compelled her to speak, but she was not compelled quickly. That matters, I think, in understanding the full measure of what occurred. The jury returned a verdict of guilty on the evening of the third day of trial. The courtroom fell silent as the foreman pronounced the words that would reshape Patricia Hartley's entire future. She stood to receive the verdict with remarkable composure, her hands steady, her expression resigned to the inevitability that had been approaching since that afternoon in the morning room. The judge sentenced her to 15 years imprisonment, acknowledging the absence of premeditation while emphasizing the seriousness of the crime and the weeks, during which she had allowed an innocent man to face conviction. It was a sentence that balanced mercy with justice, understanding with accountability. As Patricia was led away from the dock, her eyes found Miss Marple's in the gallery. Something passed between them, not forgiveness, perhaps, but recognition. The recognition that they had both been participants in a tragedy born from human weakness, and that understanding that weakness did not absolve one from its consequences. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage and wrote a letter to Patricia at the prison facility, where she would await transfer to a long-term institution. The letter was brief, containing no platitudes and no offers of false hope. Instead, it simply acknowledged what had occurred and offered a perspective that only someone like Miss Marple could offer. "You asked me once how I knew the truth," Miss Marple wrote. "The answer is that I have spent a lifetime observing human nature in its most ordinary manifestations. I have seen respectable people commit terrible acts. I have seen desperate circumstances overcome moral principle. And I have learned that the greatest mysteries in life are not those that challenge the intellect, but those that challenge our understanding of why good people sometimes commit terrible things. You were not evil, Patricia. You were human, which is to say, you were capable of both profound compassion and devastating harm." Eleanor understood this about human nature, which is why she believed conscience must be externally imposed. You understood it differently, which is why you believed your survival was more important than her moral imperative. Neither of you was entirely right, and neither of you was entirely wrong. That ambiguity is what makes your tragedy genuinely tragic, rather than merely sordid. I hope that in the years ahead, you will come to understand not just what you did, but why you did it, and perhaps find some measure of peace in that understanding. Miss Marple sealed the letter and placed it in the post, knowing that Patricia would receive it in prison, and knowing that it would likely provide no comfort whatsoever. But offering comfort had never been the purpose of the letter. The purpose was to acknowledge that even in the aftermath of violence and betrayal, there remained the possibility of being truly seen and understood. The village of St. Edmunds settled into winter with the peculiar quietness that follows great upheaval. The Thornfield house passed to Christopher, who announced his intention to make it his primary residence, suggesting that Eleanor's death, terrible as it had been, had transformed his priorities in unexpected ways. Dr. Hartley relocated to a larger city, where his damaged reputation might be less immediately evident. Thomas Blackwood continued his legal practice, though the weight of the secrets he had kept seemed to have aged him considerably, and Miss Marple remained in her cottage, her needles clicking through the endless patterns of her knitting, observing the village and its inhabitants with the patient attention of someone who had learned that every human life contained mysteries far more intricate than any detective fiction could capture. The photograph that had caused so much death and destruction had been destroyed. Its dangerous image returned to obscurity, but the secrets that had created the need to hide the photograph remained, embedded in the psychology of the village like fractures in ancient stone, visible only to those who knew precisely where to look. Chapter 10. The return to ordinary spring came to St. Edmund's with the inevitable renewal that seasons bring, indifferent to human suffering and judicial proceedings. The village gardens began their annual resurrection. Crocuses emerged from winter-hardened earth. Cherry blossoms transformed the landscape into something approaching beauty, and the birds returned with their insistent songs of territorial claim and mating intention. Life, it seemed, had no capacity for genuine mourning. It simply continued, relentlessly forward. Regardless of the tragedies that punctuated its passage, Miss Marple sat in her garden on a particularly fine April afternoon. Her knitting needles paused for once, her attention focused on the wisteria vine that had begun its climb up the cottage wall. The flowers would be magnificent in another week or two, their purple cascades creating an almost theatrical display of natural beauty. She had watched this vine grow for 20 years, had seen it survive winters and droughts, had observed its patient persistence with the same quiet appreciation she brought to all living things. Christopher Thornfield visited her that afternoon, arriving with a basket of fresh produce from the market and the bearing of a man whose life had fundamentally shifted in ways he was still processing. He had taken a leave of absence from his London position, he explained, and was considering whether he actually wanted to return to that life at all. Mother's death has made me reconsider my priorities, he said, settling into the chair she offered. I spent years resenting her, judging her as old-fashioned and controlling, but her final act was one of genuine moral conviction. She was willing to sacrifice her own peace and safety for what she believed was right. That's a form of courage I'm not certain I possess. Courage takes many forms, Miss Marple replied. Some people are brave in grand gestures, but that doesn't make quieter forms of courage any less valid. Your mother's courage was perhaps not the sort that attracts attention, but it was courage nonetheless. And now you must decide what sort of courage you wish to cultivate in your own life. Lucy and I have been discussing marriage, Christopher said, a slight flush coloring his cheeks. It seems inappropriate given the circumstances, and yet the experience of being falsely accused has somehow clarified what matters. She matters. Building a life with her matters far more than the success or failure of my career in London. Miss Marple smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her weathered face into something almost radiant. That is, perhaps, the silver lining in tragedy, the clarification of what truly matters. Your mother would have approved. After Christopher departed, Miss Marple received another visitor, Inspector Graves, who had driven out from the city specifically to see her. He carried with him a file containing the final report on Eleanor Thornfield's murder, a document that officially closed the investigation and consigned it to the archives of solved crimes. I wanted to thank you, Graves said, settling somewhat uncomfortably into her parlor. The case was solved because of your observations. Without your insights, Christopher would likely still be facing trial, and Patricia would still be walking free. Justice was served because you were willing to look beyond the obvious. Justice was served, Miss Marple corrected gently, but not without cost. An innocent man suffered weeks of accusation. A woman sits in prison. A village has been traumatized by the revelation that violence can flourish beneath the surface of respectability. I'm not certain that constitutes an unqualified good. Graves seemed troubled by this perspective. Are you suggesting that the truth shouldn't have been revealed? Not at all, Miss Marple replied. I'm suggesting that truth, however necessary, comes with consequences that we cannot always anticipate or control. Eleanor Thornfield believed that revealing the photograph would serve justice. It may have served justice, eventually, but it cost her her life. That's the complexity of moral action. It doesn't exist in isolation from consequences. Do you ever regret your role in uncovering the truth? Graves asked. Miss Marple considered this question with the seriousness it deserved. I regret that murder occurred. I regret that Eleanor felt compelled to take action that precipitated her own death. But I cannot regret the pursuit of truth, because a world in which truth is deliberately obscured is a world in which justice becomes impossible. Even when truth brings pain, its revelation is necessary. By summer, the village had largely moved forward. The sensational aspects of the case had faded from the newspapers, replaced by newer scandals in larger cities. The school year ended with Lucy Hammond being retained as the village teacher, the experience of false association with Christopher having somehow endeared her to the community rather than condemned her. Thomas Blackwood quietly expanded his legal practice, taking on cases that required the sort of discretion and confidentiality that his handling of Eleanor's sensitive documents had demonstrated he could provide. Miss Marple received a letter from Patricia Hartley in late June. The envelope bore the prison facility's official stamp, and the paper inside was ruled prison stationery, carefully filled with Patricia's precise handwriting. Dear Miss Marple, the letter began. I have had considerable time to think during my imprisonment, which I suspect was your intention in writing to me as you did. You were correct. Understanding why I did what I did has not brought peace, but it has brought a kind of clarity that I find oddly comforting. I have come to understand that I was not a victim of circumstance, though I spent years telling myself otherwise. I made choices, the choice to marry James, knowing that choice was born from fear and insecurity rather than love. The choice to hide from my past rather than acknowledge it. The choice to panic when confronted with the consequences of my choices. And finally, the choice to commit violence rather than face those consequences honestly. Eleanor was right, though her rightness cost her everything. If I had been brave enough to acknowledge my past when James and I married, the photograph would have held no power over me. If I had been honest about who I had been, Patricia Hartley would not have needed to kill Eleanor Thornfield. I will serve my sentence, and I will try to become someone worthy of forgiveness, if not by society, then at least by myself. That is what your letter taught me. That understanding ourselves is perhaps the most important form of justice we can achieve. Miss Marple kept the letter in a drawer in her desk, removing it occasionally to reread it. She recognized in Patricia's words the difficult journey from self-deception toward genuine self-knowledge, and she recognized as well the likelihood that such a journey, however valiant, might never reach completion. On a warm evening in July, Miss Marple sat in her garden as the light began its slow transformation from gold to purple. The wisteria had bloomed spectacularly, its cascading purple flowers creating an almost magical effect against the grey stone of her cottage. She thought about Eleanor Thornfield, who would never see another spring. She thought about Patricia Hartley, who would spend the next decade and a half behind prison walls. She thought about Christopher and Lucy, beginning their lives together in the shadow of tragedy, but with the possibility of genuine happiness. And she thought about the photograph, that small image that had somehow contained within it the capacity to destroy multiple lives, to reveal hidden secrets, to fracture the careful facades that people erected to protect themselves from judgment. Human nature, she reflected, was simultaneously far simpler and infinitely more complex than most people recognized. It was simple in its fundamental drives, the desire for safety, for belonging, for the preservation of reputation. And it was complex in the infinite variations with which those drives manifested across different personalities and circumstances. As darkness gathered, and the stars began their nightly emergence, Miss Marple rose from her chair and prepared for bed, her day's knitting completed. Her observations recorded in the private ledger of her memory. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new observations, new patterns to discern in the endless human drama that unfolded in the small village that was her home. But tonight, she would rest, knowing that truth had been served, justice had been administered, and the fragile peace of ordinary life had been restored until the next disruption came. As disruptions inevitably do, the photograph that had revealed the murderer had itself been revealed, examined, and destroyed. But its legacy would persist, written into the hearts and memories of everyone who had been touched by its dangerous truth. Chapter 11. The unanswered question. Autumn arrived with the inevitability of seasons turning, bringing with it the particular melancholy that attends the year's descent toward darkness. Miss Marple had lived through 84 autumns, and each one seemed to carry within it the accumulated weight of all the previous ones. The leaves fell from the wisteria vine, exposing the intricate lattice of branches beneath, and she watched the transformation with the detachment of someone who had learned that all visible beauty contains within it the seeds of its own dissolution. It was during this season that a letter arrived bearing an unexpected postmark. The envelope was cream-colored, expensive, addressed in handwriting that Miss Marple did not immediately recognize. She opened it with the careful deliberation of someone who had learned that correspondence often contained complications. The letter was from Eleanor Thornfield's solicitor in London, written on behalf of Eleanor's estate. It informed Miss Marple that Eleanor, in her will drawn up 3 years prior, had made a specific bequest to her. The letter contained no explanation, merely the instruction that a sealed envelope, also addressed to Miss Marple and marked to be opened only by the recipient, would be delivered to her residence within the week. Miss Marple sat with this information for several minutes, her knitting abandoned in her lap. She had never been particularly close to Eleanor Thornfield, their relationship having been cordial but distinctly bounded by the formality that characterized their generation. Why Eleanor would leave her anything was a question that demanded an answer. The sealed envelope arrived on a grey Wednesday morning, delivered by courier and requiring her signature. Miss Marple signed for it with her usual careful penmanship and waited until the courier had departed before opening it. Inside was a handwritten letter, dated approximately 6 months before Eleanor's death. In Eleanor's distinctive handwriting, precise, and carrying within its careful formations the weight of whatever Eleanor had felt compelled to communicate. Dear Miss Marple, the letter began. If you are reading this, it means that I am dead, and that my death has likely been violent and deliberate, rather than the natural conclusion that I had hoped my life might reach. I write this letter now, in full knowledge that I may be creating the very circumstances that will lead to the necessity of opening it. You have always seemed to me to be a woman who sees clearly what others deliberately obscure. I have watched you at village gatherings, observing human nature with a gentle attention that misses nothing. It is precisely because of this capacity for clear seeing that I am entrusting you with an explanation that the police, and perhaps even those closest to me, may not fully understand, The photograph that I discovered represents more than a personal indiscretion committed decades ago. It documents a pattern of behavior by a man who has since risen to considerable prominence in political circles. That man seduced and abandoned multiple young women, using his power and position to ensure their silence through combinations of shame, fear, and intimidation. Patricia Hartley was one of these women, though not the only one. I have spent considerable time determining whether I should reveal this photograph and the information it represents. The cost of revelation is substantial to Patricia, to Dr. Hartley, to the stability of the village itself. The cost of silence is equally substantial. A man of questionable character to influence policy that affects thousands of lives. I do not know, as I write this, which choice I will ultimately make. But I know that whichever choice I make, the consequence may be my own destruction. If I reveal the photograph, Patricia will likely be destroyed, and someone who wishes to protect her or their own reputation may resort to violence. If I remain silent, I will be complicit in allowing injustice to persist. This is the burden of knowledge. Miss Marple, the burden of understanding something that demands action, but the action itself causes suffering. I am writing this letter because I wish you to understand. Should anything happen to me, then my death would not be a simple matter of passion or desperation. It would be a consequence of moral choice, and that distinction matters. It matters because it means my death would have a meaning beyond the merely tragic. If you are reading this, I ask that you discover not simply who killed me, but why. And I ask that you consider whether my death, properly understood, might serve the purposes that my life could not. Miss Marple read the letter 3 times, her hands trembling slightly as she processed Eleanor's extraordinary foresight and the responsibility it placed upon her. Eleanor had essentially predicted her own death, and had written instructions for how it should be. Understood and addressed, the implications were staggering. Eleanor had known that revealing the photograph might cost her life, and she had chosen to reveal it anyway. More than that, she seemed to have anticipated that Patricia might be the instrument of her death. And she had written to ensure that even Patricia's action would be understood within the larger context of moral consequence rather than simple criminality. Miss Marple immediately contacted Inspector Graves, requesting an urgent meeting. When he arrived at her cottage that evening, she presented him with Eleanor's letter and watched as his understanding of the case underwent a fundamental transformation. She knew. Graves said slowly, reading through the letter a second time. Eleanor Thornfield actually anticipated that her revelation might precipitate her own death. More than that, Miss Marple replied. She seemed to anticipate that Patricia specifically might be the instrument of that death, which suggests either remarkable prescience or a deep understanding of the psychological fragility that the photograph's threatened revelation would trigger in Patricia. Why didn't she simply go to the authorities? Graves asked. Why take matters into her own hands? Because she understood, I think, that the photograph alone would not constitute sufficient evidence for legal action against the man in question, and because she believed that his continued presence in positions of influence represented an ongoing injustice that justified the risk she was taking. Graves set the letter down carefully. This changes the moral calculus considerably. Eleanor Thornfield wasn't simply an unfortunate victim, she was a woman acting deliberately on conscience, aware of the risks, accepting them anyway. Yes, Miss Marple agreed, and Patricia Hartley wasn't simply a desperate woman committing violence, she was a woman being forced to confront the consequences of secrets she had hoped to keep hidden forever Does this change anything regarding Patricia's conviction? Graves asked. It changes how we understand the crime, Miss Marple said. But it doesn't change the fact that a murder occurred, or that Patricia committed it. Eleanor chose to act, and Patricia responded with violence. Both were moral agents making conscious decisions, and both must live with the consequences. After Graves departed, Miss Marple sat alone with Eleanor's letter and contemplated the extraordinary courage it represented. Eleanor Thornfield had essentially written her own obituary, had anticipated her own death, and had arranged for that death to be understood not as a tragedy, but as the logical conclusion of a moral choice. It was perhaps the most remarkable act of conscious will that Miss Marple had witnessed in her 84 years. Eleanor had not simply lived according to her conscience, she had died according to it. Fully aware of what that choice would entail, Miss Marple placed the letter in a secure envelope and stored it in her desk, marked with instructions that it should be preserved for historical purposes. She recognized that Eleanor's letter, combined with Patricia's confession and the documentation of the entire case, created a record of extraordinary human complexity, a record that future generations might find valuable in understanding how conscience operates under pressure, how desperation can overcome morality, and how the pursuit of justice sometimes exacts costs that seem to outweigh its benefits. That night, Miss Marple dreamed of Eleanor Thornfield walking through her garden, examining the wisteria vine with the appreciation of someone who understood that beauty and mortality were inseparable concepts. When she woke, the dream had faded to the vague impressions that dreams always leave behind, but its emotional truth remained. The recognition that some people choose their own destruction in service of principles they believe transcend their individual survival. Such people were rare, and their rarity made them remarkable. Chapter 12. The photograph that revealed the murderer, Winter, descended on St. Edmunds with the particular severity that comes to English villages in the depths of December. Snow blanketed the gardens, transforming the landscape into something that resembled a Christmas postcard, picturesque and somehow deceptive in its beauty, concealing beneath its white surface the harshness of frozen earth and shortened days. Miss Marple sat in her cottage, the fire burning steadily in the hearth, and reflected on the extraordinary year that had passed since Eleanor Thornfield's death. The man in the photograph had resigned from his political position 6 months after Patricia's conviction. The resignation had been described in the newspapers as due to health concerns, a carefully constructed euphemism that fooled no one who had followed the case carefully. Eleanor's sacrifice for that was what it had become in retrospect had ultimately accomplished what she had intended. The photograph's revelation, filtered through Patricia's confession and the subsequent investigation, had reached enough people in positions of influence to make the man's continued prominence impossible, whether that outcome justified. Eleanor's death remained a question that Miss Marple pondered without reaching definitive conclusion. Justice and morality, she had learned, often existed in uncomfortable tension with one another, and no amount of reflection could perfectly reconcile their competing claims. Christopher Thornfield and Lucy Hammond were married in the autumn, a wedding that St. Edmunds attended with a mixture of genuine joy and continued fascination with the family's dramatic history that characterized village sentiment. Christopher had indeed left his London position and had begun working with a local conservation organization, discovering that meaningful work didn't require the prominence or prestige he had once pursued. Lucy continued as the village and they had purchased a cottage on the outskirts of St. Edmunds. beginning the process of building a life together in the place where they had first met under such tragic circumstances. Dr. Hartley had remarried a widow from a neighboring village and had quietly re-established a modest medical practice. The scandal that had nearly destroyed him had instead become a kind of crucible through which he emerged, diminished in prominence, but perhaps deepened in understanding regarding his own complicity in the circumstances that had contributed to Eleanor's death. He had known about Patricia's past, had kept the photograph, had allowed her to believe that her secret was safe with him. His silence had been the precondition for everything that followed. The village itself had settled into a new equilibrium, one that acknowledged the capacity for darkness that lurked beneath respectability without allowing that acknowledgement to destroy the basic civility that made communal life possible. Margaret Blackwood had become considerably more cautious about her gossip-mongering, chastened by the realization that her elaborations on facts had contributed to an innocent man's arrest. Thomas Blackwood had established a legal practice noted for its discretion and ethical rigor, taking on cases that required the kind of careful handling that his experience with Eleanor's sensitive documents had prepared him for. On a particularly cold December evening, Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor, a woman in her 60s, elegantly dressed despite the harsh weather. Arrived at her cottage and introduced herself as Margaret Hartwell, cousin to the man whose photograph had sparked the entire tragic chain of events. "I've come to thank you," Margaret said, settling into Miss Marple's parlour with the careful grace of someone accustomed to formal occasions, "for exposing my cousin for what he truly is. I've known about his predatory behaviour for 30 years, but I lacked the courage to do anything about it. Eleanor Thornfield's willingness to act, even at the cost of her own life, gave me the courage to finally speak openly about the damage he caused. Have you come forward to the authorities?" Miss Marple asked. "I have," Margaret confirmed. "I've provided names and details regarding 7 other women he seduced and abandoned over a period of 40 years. Some of them are now cooperating with investigators. The case against him is building, Miss Marple. What Eleanor Thornfield started may ultimately result in genuine legal consequences for him." After Margaret departed, Miss Marple sat with this information and felt something shift in her understanding of the tragedy that had occurred. Eleanor's death was not simply a tragedy, was the catalyst for something larger, the necessary rupture in the surface of respectability that made accountability possible. She removed Eleanor's letter from her desk and read it once more, paying particular attention to the final paragraph she had not previously focused on. "I am writing this letter because I wish you to understand. Should anything happen to me, that my death would not be a simple matter of passion or desperation. It would be a consequence of moral choice, and that distinction matters. It matters because it means my death would have a meaning beyond the merely tragic." Eleanor had been correct. Her death had meaning beyond the tragic. It had catalyzed consequences that extended far beyond St. Edmund's, affecting the lives of multiple women whose voices had been silenced by shame and fear. Patricia Hartley's act of violence, born from desperation and panic, had become the instrument through which Eleanor's larger moral purpose was ultimately served. That evening, Miss Marple sat at her writing desk and composed a letter to Patricia Hartley in prison. The letter was brief, containing no sentimentality, but rather a simple factual account of the consequences that had followed Eleanor's death. She described Margaret Hartwell's visit, the investigations being undertaken, the women who were coming forward, the possibility of genuine legal accountability for the man in the photograph. "Your desperation," Miss Marple wrote, led you to commit an act that seemed at the time to be purely destructive. But that act, filtered through Eleanor's deliberate choice to act on conscience, has become the means through which other women's suffering may be acknowledged and addressed. This does not excuse what you did, but it does provide context for understanding why you did it. You were not simply a murderer acting in isolation. You were a person whose panic triggered consequences that extended far beyond your conscious intention or understanding. As winter progressed toward its conclusion and the year moved toward its close, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the intricate web of causality that had transformed a simple garden party into a profound examination of conscience, morality, and justice. The photograph, that small image that had documented a moment of indiscretion decades in the past, had ultimately revealed not simply a murderer, but an entire system of deception and silence that had allowed harm to persist. Unchallenged, Eleanor Thornfield had chosen to disrupt that system. Knowing the personal cost, Patricia Hartley had resisted that disruption, also knowing the cost. And together, through their collision of conflicting moral imperatives, they had created the conditions for genuine change. On the final evening of the year, Miss Marple sat in her garden despite the cold, watching the last light fade from the sky. The wisteria vines stood bare and skeletal against the gathering darkness, its flowers long departed, its beauty temporarily obscured. But she knew that spring would come again, as springs always do, and the vine would bloom once more with that same purple magnificence. Life was like that. She reflected, cyclical, persistent, indifferent to human suffering, yet also capable of remarkable renewal. The photograph that had revealed the murderer had also revealed something larger about human nature, the capacity for both extraordinary moral courage and devastating cruelty, often existing simultaneously in the same person, the same moment, the same choice. She rose from her chair and returned to her cottage, where the fire had burned down to embers. She would watch the flames kindle and grow, and settled into her familiar chair with her knitting. The needles clicked in their ancient rhythm, creating patterns from simple yarn, transforming chaos into order through patient, repetitive action. Outside, the village slept. Inside the homes of St. Edmunds, people carried their secrets, the small deceptions, the hidden shames, the carefully guarded truths about who they truly were beneath the facades they presented to the world. Some of those secrets would remain hidden forever. Others would eventually be exposed, as Eleanor's vigilance had ensured that some must be. Miss Marple knitted steadily into the evening, her needles marking time, her hands creating beauty from simple materials. Tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new observations, new patterns to discern in the infinite complexity of human nature. But tonight, the photograph that had revealed the murderer had served its ultimate purpose. It had exposed not simply a crime, but the systemic injustice that made that crime inevitable. And in that exposure lay the seeds of genuine transformation, or difficult, costly transformation, but transformation nonetheless. The mystery was solved. Justice, in its imperfect and complicated way, had been served, and life, as it always does, continued its patient forward movement into whatever future awaited.